Jesus' parable of the prodigal son is perhaps one of the most familiar parables within our Bible. It starts out by introducing us to a man with two sons. And the younger son went to his father, saying, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So after the father divided his property between the two sons and gave the younger son his share, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. But here's my question. Why? Why was the younger son so dead set on getting so far away from home? Some would say that it's because he's a good-for-nothing, self-indulgent scoundrel who only cared about himself. And if the truth be told, that sounds pretty consistent with our text, which paints the picture of a son who would insist upon his inheritance before his father's death. And after all, we are indeed told that he wasted the inheritance in decadence and debauchery. I grant you that he made some poor decisions after receiving his inheritance, but it seems to me that he may have been running away from something. Well, of course he was running away from something, you may say. He was running away from his responsibilities, possibly. But maybe he just couldn't stand one more oppressive day with the likes of his older brother. Given the response of the older brother upon the younger son's return, I would speculate there had more than likely been an ongoing grudge between the two brothers, which eventually culminated in the younger son's leaving home. And after making his escape, the younger son made some unwise life choices, which eventually landed him in a pig pen. Churches today are facing up to the undeniable fact that thousands of its members are making the same decision as this morning's younger son. They are leaving the churches because they are unwilling to stick around in an unwelcome atmosphere. Curtis Zolman grew up attending a Nazarene church in rural Michigan that had rules he compared to those in the movie Footloose. No dancing, no drinking. When he was in 9th grade, he told his parents that he was gay. They sent him to a straight camp, where Curtis said he was told he'd go to hell if he didn't conform. But Curtis remained a Christian until after high school graduation, when he came out publicly. Soon after, his youth pastor told him he could no longer be on the church praise team or attend youth group, and asked Curtis to sit in the back during church because he was, quote, actively living in sin, end quote. That was 10 years ago, said Curtis, and I've been to a church maybe 4 times since then. I recently had a Facebook conversation with someone who described themselves as having been driven away from religion by 2 different churches that did conversion therapy on them at a very young age, which, quote, really screwed me up, end quote. I told the person I was glad they were able to make their escape from religion. A recent study revealed that queer Christians like Curtis and this person are quitting the church twice as much as others. And women as well are leaving the church and opting out of toxic religion because they are tired of fighting church leaders to be treated equally. And the same goes for the HIV positive, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Churches may display a sign above their doors that say all are welcome, but it often comes with conditions. There are rules to which one must adhere if you hope to experience the privilege of feeling welcome. That attitude of thinly disguised exclusiveness is what prompted Jesus' parable in the first place. We read that the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." And so while it's a story about God's abundant grace, a grace that causes the Father to cast all dignity to the side and go running down the road with outstretched arms at the side of his Son, who was at long last making his way home, it's more than that. If it were only a story about God's grace, it could have ended right there with the Father and the Son embracing. But it doesn't. It goes on to highlight the resentful older son. A son who would have been just as happy if his sibling had stayed away. A son who may have followed the rules, but whose attitude was less than ideal. "For all these years, I have been working like a slave for you," he says to his father. "You haven't given me so much as a young goat, but you killed a fatted calf for this son of yours." It must have stung. Not only the son's resentment of his brother, but his severing of all ties from him. This son of yours. And so I picture the father looking him square in the face, and as if to remind him that regardless of how he may feel about his brother, they are still siblings. He says, "We celebrate because this brother of yours was thought to be as good as dead, but is found to be alive." This brother of yours. And that's why Jesus told the story. Yes, it was a story of God's boundless grace, but it was also a story about how that grace is extended to everyone, both saints and sinners, because we are all siblings. And somehow, we've got to learn to live together under the same roof. Recent research reveals that 76% of LGBT people are open to returning to the church they have walked out on. And this includes 1/3 of LGBT people raised in theologically conservative faith communities. This morning's story is open-ended. Do the brothers finally reconcile their differences and come to accept each other despite the gulf that separates them? Does the older brother remind his sibling that when the father said, "All that is mine is yours," he meant that literally, because after the father died, all that remained of the property would go to the younger brother? Was the younger son's behavior nothing but a ploy to get back into his father's graces? Does the younger son take on the victim role in an effort to play up to the father's sympathies? What happens next? We don't know, and I think that's what the gospel writer intended. And for right now, we don't really know how things will play out within our current day church either. Some churches are opening themselves up to self-examination and taking an honest look at how they can change for the better. Some churches are digging in their heels, refusing to give an inch. And some churches are somewhere in between, willing to be open to change in some areas, but unwilling to compromise in other areas. And so, although our church may be radically inclusive with regard to sexual orientation, HIV status, gender expression, and gender identity, how willing are we to welcome someone who strongly and vocally adheres to a different view than ours with regard to, say, abortion or gun control, homelessness, or immigrants? How willing are we, and how do we go about it? I don't have the answers to those questions, but I believe Paul's words were divinely inspired when he wrote to the church in Rome, "If possible, to the best of your ability, live at peace with all people." When we look into the face of the person who stands on the other side of the fence, may we see the face of a neighbor and potential friend. May we see the face of a sibling created in the image of God just like us. May we look past the surface and look for the strength and scars that has made them who they are. And then may we work together to dismantle the fence. Amen.